But my name is Scott Mitchell, and I'm with the Silver River Museum. And welcome to another episode of Museum Mysteries. This is our first episode, our first museum mystery for Native Americans. It's Native American Heritage Month, and Native Americans are a fascinating subject. I think we all know from our discussions, if you've joined me previously, about the Spanish explorers. Were the first Europeans here, and they arrived about 500 years ago. So think about Ponce de Leon and Spanish conquistadors. We've talked about that a lot at the museum. But who was here before the Spanish arrived? Who were here when the Spanish arrived? In Florida, Native Americans. That's exactly right. When the Spanish explorers first arrived, Florida, and in fact, all of the Americas, North America, Central America, South America, there were people everywhere. There were Native Americans everywhere, lots of different cultures. And the people in Florida, in fact, the Native Americans right here around Marion County in north central Florida, we know that they were referred to as Timucuans. We know that because the Spanish wrote that name down. So we're lucky to have that information. But the Native Americans did not have metal. They didn't have cars or trucks or computers or plastic or glass, but metal is an important thing because it's very sharp and hard, right? So if you are living out in the wilderness, think about if you as a class had to go live in the woods and find your own food and make your own shelter. How would you do that if you couldn't go to the store? So think about that. You would have to catch your own food or raise it in a garden, right? You would have to make your own tools with only things that you can find in nature. So let's talk about that for a minute. If you can't go to the store and buy a sharp knife or an axe made out of steel, what is the next sharpest thing that you can find in nature? What's the next hardest and sharpest thing that you can find in nature? This is important because you have to cut down trees, and you might have to kill an animal to eat because you couldn't go to a grocery store. You would have to have tools to take the hide off that animal and turn it into leather to make clothes for when the winter came. There's lots of things you would need hard, sharp materials for. So if you don't have metal, what's the hardest thing you can find? Stone. Yes, stone. So here is an example of a stone spear point. This is basically a piece of a rock that's been broken in such a way that it makes it like a knife blade, and it's very sharp along the edges. So this is actually a spear point. Now, a lot of people call these arrowheads. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but that is a prehistoric spear point. You can see it has some writing on it. That's because it's from the museum. But look at that. That is the hardest, sharpest thing you can find in nature in Florida if you don't have metal. If you can't go buy a steel axe or a steel knife, this is the sharpest thing. Now, what in the world does that have to do with today's museum mystery object? Well, I'm going to tell you. Today's museum mystery object is this item right here. If you had a chance to print the worksheet, that's great. If not, that's okay. This just gives the students a place to capture some notes. But this little object right here is our museum mystery object. And I'm going to show you one of them in real life. So I don't know if anyone has ever seen one of these before, and it looks pretty unusual. This is a handle on this end, and these pieces here are made from deer antlers, okay? And the part in the middle is made from wood. But this is a handle, it's kind of rounded, and this end has a hook right there. And that's an important part of this tool. So there's another part to this tool. You hold this in your hand, right? But this hook, remember in the picture, we have a few things that look like arrows along with this item. Now, these are not arrows. These are long, much longer. There's one of those spear points lashed onto the end. And look how long it is. It goes and keeps going and keeps going. It's like a big, giant, long arrow, but it's not an arrow. There's some feathers in the back. And look at this. It has a hole back here in the very back. So today's museum mystery object is really this thing here, but you use it with this. So teachers, let's have your students talk just a little bit about what are these two things used for, and why would prehistoric Native Americans needed them? So let's send me some ideas via chat, because we've got 4 different classes. I can't really talk to everyone all at the same time. If you can talk about this and send me some ideas, we will go from there. All right, I have a message that says we can see you, but do not have video in this classroom for you to see us. Okay, well, if you can see me, that's okay. That's okay. Thank you for letting me know, though. Okay, so here is our museum mystery object. Anybody know what in the world this thing is? If you were a prehistoric Native American, this would have been a very important tool. It would have done several things that were very important to you. And you probably would have grown up using one from the time you were a little kid. It would have been an everyday object. All right. I have a couple of guesses here. Sword, question mark, arrow, question mark. Well, it's not a sword, but it's related to arrows. It's not an arrow. You don't throw this, you hold on to it. So arrow is a little warmer, but not quite. Any other ideas? Any other ideas? Okay, I'm going to have to tell you, because this is a pretty weird thing. This is what we call a spear thrower. Now, I see some information here. Spear fishing, hunting animals for food, clothing, and shelter, and to defend themselves. Now we're on the money. Okay, so this is a tool that you would use to throw spears. So remember I said you hold on to this, and obviously the spear is the part that goes flying. Now, why not a bow and arrow? How come they had this contraption? Why didn't they just use a bow and arrow? Well, they didn't always have the bow and arrow. The bow and arrow got invented just like the automobile or the computer or electricity. It wasn't always around. So Native Americans did not always have the bow and arrow. And this is what they used before they invented the bow and arrow. Now, you can't go to the grocery store. You can't go to the mall and buy a coat. You can't go to Target. So how do you get those things you need? You have to go out and catch them, like I said earlier. So if you've ever seen a deer or a rabbit, and you're trying to catch, or a squirrel, you're trying to catch one of those animals to put it in the cooking pot because you're hungry and you have to feed your family. You can't just run after that deer and tackle it and wrestle it down and, strangle it and throw it in the cooking pot. They're very fast, and some animals are dangerous. You don't want to get close to them. So this is where the Native Americans would use the spear. Let me show you how it works, because you could also use it if you had enemies nearby. Say your neighbors weren't very friendly and they were trying to come and steal your food or set fire to your village in a war. The warriors would use the spear thrower and spears to scare the enemies away. They wouldn't want to come around because these spears were very deadly. So remember, this has a hole in the back of the spear, right? Can everybody see that? And this has a hook, and these two go together. So I'm going to hold it here on the end, and I'm going to put the hook in the hole, just like that. So now that spear is attached to this spear holder at the back, the very back. And then with my fingers, I kind of grab it. And now I've got the spear ready to throw with the spear thrower. So the spear thrower is kind of like a catapult, right? It launches the spear this way. And this makes the spear go much further and hit with much more power. Now at the museum, and hopefully we'll get to see students there for field trips again soon. If you guys were at the museum and I was telling you about the spear thrower, I would pick the shortest kid in the class with the shortest arms, and I would say, hey, you come up here and help me for a minute. And I would get that kid to come up, and we would do a little demonstration. I would say, let's say the kid's name is Joe with the short arms. I'd say, Joe, stand next to me. And I'd ask the class, whose arm is longer, my arm or Joe's arm? And Joe would have a little arm because he's 10 years old. And I've got a big long arm because I'm like a orangutan with big arms. I'm 6'4". So I'd say, you have the biggest arm, Mr. Mitchell. And I'd say, well, who can throw a spear the hardest, me or Joe? And they would say, well, you can throw the spear the hardest, Mr. Mitchell. You've got big old orangutan arms and Joe has little short arms. And I would say, that's right. So, oh, I got to show you this. Look at this. If this is where the spear leaves from, so this is my arm without the spear thrower. If this is where the spear leaves from, look what this does to my arm. It makes my arm twice as long. So this is the end of my arm now, practically. So they would throw that spear, but this is now how long their arm is. So it makes their arm twice as long. So it's like a giant catapult for your arm. And that means these spears would go way farther than you could throw them without the spear thrower. And they would also hit with a lot more power. So if you grew up using a spear thrower to hunt, you would be very, very accurate. You could sneak up on your prey and capture it, kill it with a spear using the spear thrower. And I know that sounds mean. A lot of people are against hunting, and I understand that. But you have to remember, this is Native American Heritage Month. We are talking about prehistoric Native Americans that could not go to the grocery store. It was a matter of survival. So how is this tool different from the bow and arrow? Well, the bow and arrow was invented later. And one of the big differences is that the bow is kind of like a big spring. You pull the string back, and when you let go, it flies forward and it shoots that arrow. So the string is doing the work. The wood and the string is doing the work on a bow and arrow. With the spear thrower, it uses your arm. The other big difference is that the stone points on arrows are much smaller. This is an arrow point. Look how tiny that is. This is a spear point. Why would you want to use a small sharp point on an arrow? Arrows are much smaller than spears. And this is a spear point. So why would the arrow point have to be smaller? Well, the arrow point has to fly through the air on a small piece of wood. So it has to be much lighter. If you put this on an arrow, it wouldn't go very far. It's too heavy, it would just fall. So bows and arrows and spears are similar, but they're different. Okay, now one more thing. Remember I showed you the stone point that is attached to the wooden shaft, and it has feathers back here, helps it fly straight through the air, kind of like airplane wings. I have a few other examples. Look at this one. This one is a different style of spear point. And you see this dark stuff. This is glue made with pine sap, pine pitch that's put over the leather. And this is a solid piece of wood. This is a piece of long bamboo. Here's more glue. So this one actually has a couple of different types of wood and has 3 feathers in the back to make it fly straight. And it, of course, has the hole. And I have one more. They use different types of spears for different types of hunting. This one has a long bone point, kind of like a big long bone chopstick. And it's lashed to a wooden spear shaft with rawhide and with glue. And then it has a long shaft, and again, it has the feathers to help it fly through the air with the hole in the back. So these are atlatl darts or spears. Now, did you hear that word I just used? Atlatl. Have you heard that word before? Atlatl. It's a weird word. Atlatl. Did you know atlatl is an Aztec Indian word? The Aztecs were Native Americans that lived in Mexico. And when the Spanish soldiers entered Mexico to conquer the Aztec warriors were using these spear throwers to fight the Spanish conquistadors. And the Atlatls called these things, or the Aztecs called these things atlatls. So this is an atlatl or a spear thrower. Again, the Spanish wrote that word down. All right, I have a PowerPoint that I want to show you. And then I'm going to ask you some questions, and you can ask me some questions. All right, so here is, can everyone see that? Give me a thumbs up if you can see it. All right, I see thumbs up. So there's our drawing of our atlatl or our spear thrower with the two spears. Here's a close-up of a hand holding an atlatl and a spear. And you can see over here, they've actually tied a rock onto the end of the spear thrower or the atlatl. And that gives it a little more weight on the end to give it a little more power. You can see the hook there. That's kind of a bone hook. It's a different style. And this one doesn't have a handle. So they sometimes looked a little bit different, but they all did the same thing. But that's how you would hold it. And remember, you don't let the spear thrower go. You hold on to that. An advantage there was you could carry several spears, right? You could shoot several spears and you had one atlatl or one spear thrower. All right, here's a close-up showing how the hook goes into the hole in the back of the spear. That's important because that's what holds the spear onto it. Now, this is an actual Atlatl hook that was dug up or excavated from an archaeological site. That's a place where people used to live thousands of years ago. This one is carved from deer antler, and it was found, I think, in Virginia, but this is a prehistoric Atlatl hook that would have been attached to a wooden atlatl like the one I was showing you earlier. And here's the hook here where the base of the atlatl spear would attach. But this is an actual atlatl hook. And archaeologists go and they dig for clues in places where people used to live, and they find clues and artifacts and evidence that tell us how those people used to live. And out west, where it's very dry, out in the desert, they have dry caves where people used to live, right? And in those dry environments, they actually sometimes find old wooden atlatls that they never rotted and fell apart because the environment is so dry, there's no moisture in the air. So these are actually prehistoric atlatls that were found out west in prehistoric cave sites. So they weren't cave people like you see in the movies. These were Native Americans, but they would use the caves as shelters. And archaeologists have found this one's broken on the end, but here you can see this is where the hook would have been. And here's a handle. This is a drawing of someone throwing, showing you kind of the motion. It's like a baseball player throwing a ball, pitching a ball. All right, now they have modern atlatls, modern spear throwers. And here's a young student who is practicing with a spear thrower at a target. You can see all the holes in the target. They're doing pretty good with their aim. And you can see some lines here on the lawn showing them how far back to stand. So this is something that sometimes people will actually still practice today as a sport. Now here's another student who has just launched her spear from her spear thrower. And you can see that the spear is flying away, and that's where it would have been hooked to the spear. If you look closely, you can see little handles. She's got her thumb through a handle to help her hold the spear. But that's kind of the motion of how it works. So that is the overview of spear throwers or atlatls. Now, let me tell you, the Native Americans in Florida were here during the Ice Age at the beginning. That's when people first moved into Florida. So we call those people Paleo Indians. So probably 15,000 years ago, there were Native Americans living here. They did not have the bow and arrow. And that's archaeologists find these spears. They also find the bone or the antler atlatl hooks. So that's how we know that the Native Americans had these things. Later, archaeologists start finding little tiny arrow points in the ground where people used to live, and they would drop them. And that's how we know that the bow and arrow got invented later, from the clues in the ground. So that is my museum mystery object for today, a spear thrower, also called an atlatl by the Aztec Indians in Mexico. And a lot of people still refer to these things as atlatls. So does anyone have any questions? Anyone have any questions about spear throwers or Native Americans or atlatls? I am happy to try to answer them. And we hope that one day soon we will start to see field trips back to the Silver River Museum, and maybe you guys can come visit in person. So teachers, if the students have questions, you can send them to me. Now, we do have some questions for you. I'll read a few of these from the worksheet. Explain why this object could help Native Americans survive in the wilderness. Well, we had one answer already: to defend themselves and to catch food. So those are two very important things. All right, we have a question. What was the hole in the spear for? The hole in the back of the spear, remember, that's where the hook attaches. So an arrow has a notch for the arrow string, the bowstring, but a spear has a hole where the Atlatl hook would attach. That's what the hole is for. All right, what animals can they hunt with these? Well, just about anything that is big enough to stick with a spear. So the Paleo Indians back in the Ice Age would hunt giant things like mammoths and ground sloths and things like that. Later, when those animals became extinct, Native Americans would hunt anything from a white-tailed deer all the way down to fish or turtles or alligators. They could spear them with an atlatl. They were very good with their aim. Okay, why did they use deer antlers? Because this is a nice hard object. It's harder than wood, and it doesn't break very easily, and it's pretty easy to carve. And if it wore out, you could replace it rather than having to replace the whole wooden thing. All right, they did catch fish with these, and I'm sure they could probably kill a bear. That's another question. If you had enough people who ganged up with these spears on a bear, the poor bear probably would not have much of a chance. Those are good questions. All right, I have a question for you. Describe some different objects that we still use for the same purpose today. So what do we use that has taken the place of an atlatl today? If you're out hunting, what would you use if you didn't want to use the spear thrower? Knives, bows and arrows. Well, what about today? What would you use to hunt a deer that was far away from you? Guns. Yes, I see swords. Not so much. You have to get close to the deer with a sword. That's kind of hard. They run away. So people now use firearms to hunt because those deer, they won't let you get close to them. And again, not everyone agrees with hunting, but some people still hunt for food. Okay, explain the different ways in which archaeologists learned about this object. Well, there's a couple of ways. You can dig for clues like the antler Atlatl hook or the spear point itself, or you can study historical records, first-person accounts, primary sources, secondary sources, like those records that the Spanish wrote down. Those Aztec warriors are using these tools called atlatls to throw spears at us. So you can go and actually look for clues in the ground, or you can use historical documents, primary sources. A couple of different ways you can learn about them. All right. Compare this object to the bow and arrow. How are they different and how are they the same? How is the spear thrower and the spear similar and different to a bow and arrow? Well, they both launch a spear or a projectile. The spear thrower throws a spear, the bow and arrow throws an arrow. Arrows are smaller, the points are much smaller and lighter. So those are some similarities and differences. The big one is that the spear thrower uses your arm as power, and the bow uses the tension in the bow. It's like a big spring. So it's a different type of energy. But they basically both do the same thing. All right, do you guys have any other questions for me? Those are the questions on the worksheet we kind of went over. Any other questions from the students? I see a couple of hands up. Send them to me via chat, teachers. And if you want to go to the Silver River Museum, even though we're not doing field trips, the museum's open on the weekends, on Saturdays and Sundays. You can go there with your family. It's out at the Silver Springs State Park. And there's lots of spear points and information about Native Americans in the museum. It's a good place to go if you want to learn about Native Americans. All right, I see another question. It says, what is the sharpest object they used on a spear? Well, it would be a stone spear point. And some of the stone spear points were made almost like needle tips. They were very, very sharp on the point. So this stone we call chert or flint, and it's a natural stone that we find here in Florida. And if you break it in in a certain way, it makes a very sharp edge. It's almost like broken glass. It's really sharp. So they would break them on purpose to make this shape, and then they would tie them on the ends of their spears. What animals did they hunt with a spear? Well, we talked about that. Basically anything that they could sneak up on. So everything from deer right on down to fish. You know, a squirrel might be kind of hard because they're up in the tree, but things like deer, bison, elk, bears, raccoons, fish, turtles, alligators, those types of animals, they would use the atlatl to spear. How much bone held to the wood? How was the bone held onto the wood? Oh, that's a good question. Well, this is hollow. The Atlatl hook, the antler Atlatl hook, and the handle is hollow. And then there's a wooden peg part that goes up inside. So it's kind of like stuck onto the wood, and they would have glued it on there. They could make glue from pine pitch. Did you ever get pine sap on you and it makes you all sticky? They would make glue from that. So, and they may have actually put some leather around this as well if it didn't want to stay. But this is a peg that fits into a socket. So it goes together, and then it has some glue in there to hold it on. That's a good question. All right. Do we have other questions? You guys are thinking, because if you look at this, that's a good question. How is it held together? All right. Well, if you all will come back and join me in a couple of weeks, this whole second quarter, I'll have a different museum mystery object each time. So the next time I come back, we'll have a different object from the Silver River Museum, but it will have to do with Native Americans. All this month is Native Americans. So this quarter will deal with Native Americans. Next quarter, after the holidays, we'll have African American Heritage Month. After that, we'll have U.S. military history in Florida. So we've got some exciting things to talk about. We have all kinds of interesting objects at the museum that I'll show you. So I hope to see you back. I appreciate all the great questions. Teachers, thank you for joining us, and we will see you in 2 weeks. Have a good rest of the day. Bye, students. Bye.